there's a problem about specific guidelines and regulations, and then like you hear like they're like, oh well, you know, we don't know if we can do this, and this, and then like they had this one person who was she's a scientist, and so she used to work for she used to be in the Trump administration for like the regulations of food or whatever, and so the news person was like, oh, so how do you feel about, you know, this and this, and she was like, oh well, you know, I'm a scientist first, so I'm gonna, you know, follow, you know, what the data shows. And she's like, oh, so it doesn't have to do with the fact that you got all this money from these corporations to help fund these certain like agendas. And she was like, no, not. And then like they show like a quick second of like all the food corporations that backed her like millions of dollars, like hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars. And you're just like, bitch, like you're not trying to stop, you're not trying to regulate them. Girl, you got over $60 million worth of fucking of like money. She's like, well, you know, that money was for the university and this, and you're over here thinking like, yeah, but that shit says specifically you. That's what you got. Like, you got that money. Yes. And you're just like, what the fuck? And then like the lawyer was like, he's like, people, he's like, I don't know what goes on, but he's like, when people get into these high positions, like they're like announced for these very high positions, he's like something about them, like they get all political and they don't want to actually solve the problem, and you're just like, damn. I know. That's why I was like, you know, this is crazy. Like, this whole thing crazy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did the whole testing too, and the guy from Purdue was like, "Oh, our chicken doesn't contain salmonella," so they did the test on Purdue chicken. They're like, "Oh, well, we just found like." At this one store, 11% of your chicken has salmonella. And then the guy was like, oh, well, yeah. And so the guy was like, oh, well, in order for it to be accurate data, he was like, I would probably need like, and she was like, well, how much chicken would you need to prove, you know, that you have salmonella in your food, in your chicken? And he was like, 150 chicken. So they tested 150 chickens across the United States, and 29% of the chicken found had salmonella. From Purdue farming. Possibly, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, it's already in the chicken. It's the game of chicken, like, no pun intended. Like, what are the odds of you getting salmonella? That's what the game they're playing. It's a probability game. Yeah. I was like, damn, yo, they are savage. I catch you. I know. I agree, baby. I agree, baby. I'm like, wow, yo. And the professor toward like everyone towards the end were like, I would not think in the year, you know, of this year, we would be discussing issues about human lives. Yeah, and so like the sad part was the professor who's the food professor. His son died because of an outbreak of Jack in the Box chicken back in 1993. His 16-month-old child died. So like he's even more adamant about it because he's like, dude, like this all could have been avoided if you like would have done your fucking job. Yeah, and then one of the Congress people, she almost died from salmonella, so that's why she advocates for like all these regulations on food and farmers. So like, you're like, dude, like, this ain't no bullshit. Like, these people legit, like, they're not fucking with you. So this one guy was like, yeah, he was like, so he's like, it's pretty hard to be, health and safe conscious in the kitchen. He's like, you try to be. He's like, you try to be. He's like, but, and then they did like a perfect example of like a person who's pretty safe in the kitchen would do. And they're like, oh, so you clean the chicken, but you didn't know you actually contaminated the faucet. You grabbed dish soap, but you contaminated the dish soap because you touched the dish soap. And you're like, dude, what the fuck? And so like, when he was breaking this shit down, he was like, there are 10 times in this scenario where you have contaminated. I was like, yeah. And he was like, and you're trying to do the right thing, but like, I was like, like, and yeah, and like one of the people was like, yeah, he's like these, and she was a lady. The lady was like, yeah, she's like, it doesn't make sense why you would try to follow these old school regulations because it's bacteria. You can't fucking see it. She's like, you have to test she's like, if you want to solve this, you say you test every chicken, you test every produce, you change the regulations on how these farmers are farming. And so this guy was explaining it, like, he was like, what you don't know is that when like farmers, when they farm, they actually have like their cattle right next to their produce. And so it's the waste and fecal from the cattle that goes down the drain. It goes, so he likes explaining this process, and you're like, ain't no fucking way.